I would note that Senator Cruz suggested that perhaps it was scheduling issues that prevented the government's witnesses from attending. This hearing was noticed two weeks ago, and indeed just a few days ago we received a letter from the Department of Justice that did not claim any scheduling conflicts, simply stated that the Department of Justice declined to attend. I would suggest that was not inadvertence. I would note as well that Senator Cruz followed the lead of President Obama in invoking two shibboleths, neither one of which this hearing concerns. The first one, he said, is that we have no war with Islam. That is certainly correct. There are millions of peaceful Muslims across the face of the globe, and President Obama and Senate Democrats do grave disrespect to them when they suggest some sort of equivalence between peaceful Muslims and radical Islamic terrorists. To suggest that confronting radical Islamic terrorists is somehow hostile to peaceful Muslims bears no bearing on reality. I would note as well that Senator Cruz, like President Obama, suggested this is just about uttering a few words, radical Islamic terrorism. No one has suggested the words radical Islamic terrorism are some magic incantation that saying them out loud will suddenly make it go away. But you cannot fight an enemy you do not acknowledge, that you pretend does not exist, and that you refuse to confront. It's not simply that President Obama, like Senate Democrats, won't say radical Islamic terrorism. It is that they have engaged in a, quote, purge to erase any focus on radical Islamic terrorism. Senator Cruz mentioned a minute ago that we are, quote, still trying to make sense of the terror attack in Orlando. One is only still trying to make sense of it if one ignores the actions and words of the terrorist. A terrorist who pledged his allegiance to ISIS and whose pledge of allegiance was edited out of his 9/11 call by the Obama administration. An action that would make George Orwell proud. It only makes no sense if you do not listen to the promises to murder as many innocents as possible. And the purpose of this hearing is to focus on the connections between that policy of willful blindness of insisting there is no such thing as radical Islamic terrorism, and the repeated failures of this administration to prevent terrorism. When the Orlando terrorist tells his co-workers that he's affiliated with Al-Qaeda, when the Orlando terrorist is interviewed 3 times by the FBI, when the Orlando terrorist has connections to an American suicide bomber, when the Orlando terrorist's father is publicly proclaiming on YouTube his support for the Taliban, the administration focused on fighting radical Islamic terrorism would have watched that individual very, very closely to prevent the terror attack that he was giving signal after signal after signal was a real risk. And Orlando is not the only instance. Over and over and over again, this administration has the warning signs, but because of political correctness doesn't act on them, and the result is innocent Americans are killed. Now, at this point, I would like to recognize Mr. Carlin and Mr. Steinbeck to provide their testimony, but they have refused to attend. So with that, I will invite the members of the second panel to please come forward. And each of you will be sworn in momentarily. And while you're coming forward, I will begin by introducing each of the members of the second panel. So, Ms. Kara, I will note that I've asked you now twice if your organization has the view that the 9/11 Commission report was bigoted or offensive, and twice you have declined to answer that pretty straightforward question, so let me try it a different direction.
Oh, well, maybe I didn't understand your question properly, Mr. Chairman. The use of the term in general by the 9/11 Commission report, I don't think is problematic in itself. I think it's in general as officials are talking about what the threat is. I think that's what my concern is.
Well, if it wasn't a concern, then why would it be purged from 126 down to 0,000?
I can't explain the
administration's.
I can't. I obviously cannot speak for the administration and these government agencies that did that, and what their thinking was, and developing those documents.
They did
but
so
what
in
I can
response
say,
to a request from your organization in writing calling for a quote purge.
we asked for targeted training materials. That's what we called for.
Well, let me try it a different direction. On March 16th, 2015, the Long Island Press quoted Glenn Catan, who is the legal director for your organization, as saying, quote, like, what are you going to do about radicalization in the Muslim community? That's nonsense. There is no such thing. I'm curious, do you agree with the legal director of your organization that there is no such thing in the Muslim community?
Well, this is what we do believe, Mr. Chairman. What we believe, and this is based on attacks we've seen in our country in just the last year alone, whether it's the Orlando shooting, the attack on a women's health clinic, the attack at the AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, we know that extremist violence takes many forms and people motivated regardless of their race, religion, or ideology. And what we also know is that there's no pathway, so to speak, to get to that point of engaging in violence. What the national security and law enforcement experts say is that the common thread that you see is vulnerable individuals who are seeking a sense of purpose. And so we totally disabuse and do not believe in this canard that there's somehow a pathway to radicalization. And that's what numerous studies have shown as well.
So I want to give you just one more opportunity to answer the question directly, because I don't believe you did. Do you agree with your legal director who said, quote, there is no such thing as radicalization in the Muslim community?
There are violent individuals in all communities, including the Muslim community. But is
it connected to any ideology?
There are some people who, where there is ideology that's a part, but ideology is not the center or even part of the center of the causation for what causes people to engage in violence. And it's not just me that's saying that. It's experts like my colleague, Mr. German, and law enforcement and national security experts who say that.
So I'm just going to give you one more opportunity to say whether yes or no you agree with the legal director that there's no such thing as radicalization in the Muslim community. I'll note for the record, Senator Durbin apparently doesn't want you to answer that question.
I would like you to show the courtesy of this witness instead of badgering her.
Thank you,
Mr.
Senator
Chairman,
Durbin.
you've been very correct.
You know, I'd like an administration that shows the courtesy to the victims of radical Islamic terrorism and doesn't edit a 9/11 call from a terrorist who's murdering 49 people in Orlando and pretending the threat doesn't exist.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to say that I think you've been very respectful to this witness. The witness has not answered your question, and I think you had a right to pursue it. And you did it in a gentlemanly, professional way, and I'm disappointed that Senator Durbin would not understand that.